Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, back for our weekly Penn State chat with Joel Haas of the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian football editor. This is it. Penn State's first in Los Angeles. I'll be taking the trip out. I'll be flying out on Friday. Looking forward to catching that game in person. If you see me out there, feel free to say hi. But Joel, I'm excited to break this down with you. Before we do, just want to thank another sponsor for our episode of the podcast. It's Voodoo Brewing State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street. VBC State College has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Monday for weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, and this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you all at the State College Pub. All right, Joel, let's get into this. I wanted to talk about Penn State's the perception that they've been starting slow, particularly offensively. James Franklin was asked about it in his weekly news conference on Monday. He kind of demurred and was like, we got to be better there, gave a little bit of coach speak. They haven't had a game, where they started in all three phases was, I think, the most relevant point that he brought up. You think of the Bowling Green game, they couldn't get stops early. You think about the Kent State game, the avalanche of points didn't come to that last 5 minutes of the second half. The Illinois game, they really, I think, was more offensively than, well, I guess you could argue defensively because they gave up the touchdown on the first drive. And then offensively, they never really put that game away until late. But it also did not feel like Illinois was particularly close. So my question for you is, are these starts that Penn State has had in any facet of the game, are they a concern for you heading into a very unfamiliar environment in LA? Obviously, no current Penn State players have played there. It's not a situation just like any other Big Ten road trip where you're going into, like going into Ohio State. It's a tough place to play, but Penn State has familiarity with that. That doesn't exist here. So are you concerned at all about the slow starts, particularly as they pertain to this road trip?
Yeah, definitely. Like you mentioned, whether it was offense, defense coming out slow, we've seen it kind of from all sides of the ball for Penn State. And I think I would be more concerned about the offensive side of the ball, especially because those first two drives are, whether it's the first drive or first two drives, they're scripted. That's something that you run through during practice, right? You should have those plays down, and you know exactly what plays are coming to start. You probably don't even need really the offensive coordinator to be making those calls. And Franklin was even asked about that this week during media, about kind of scripting those plays and things like that. And he confirmed, they do script those plays for those first couple of drives. They practice it, they rep it all week, and then they should be ready to go during the game. Sometimes they have to make adjustments kind of based on the defensive alignment. But regardless, those should theoretically be your best offensive drives to come out and start the game. You're trying to maybe, catch the defense by surprise, kind of hit them hard out of the gate, and Penn State has come out pretty sluggish. And then again, defensively, they've also had struggles. You mentioned the Illinois game. They go out, give up a touchdown right away, go down 7-0. And that ended up, being Illinois' only score of the game, but obviously, not a great way to start. And so if Penn State does something like that against USC, I think it could end up being a much bigger problem because obviously, Penn State sitting at 5-0 and now up to number 4 in the country, which I don't know if they were necessarily deserving of a top 4 spot, but it is what it is. And obviously they haven't really been bitten by those slow starts yet. But a team like USC with a high-powered offense, if you fall behind early, you might be in trouble. I think for Penn State, you want an early lead. You want to kind of put that pressure on USC. You don't want to fall behind, on the road in what should be a relatively hostile environment. I know they sold out the stadium. Obviously, it's not known for being one of the better environments, but again, it's a sellout. It's a big matchup against, they're hosting a number 4 team in the country, so they should be, fired up for that matchup. 3:30 kick, and so, I think if you're Penn State, if you get off to a slow start and fall behind, it might be too difficult this time to come back the way they've done in the past.
Let me ask you this question, though, Joel. To what extent do you think Andy Kotelnicki is setting things up sometimes? Because we hear that a lot in football parlance. Is sometimes you're not just calling plays in a vacuum and in terms of that particular drive or that particular quarter, early on, but you're kind of trying to see how the defense is going to react to things to set up play calls for later. Do you think that there is? Do you think that's going on with this offense at all? Where maybe Andy Kotelnicki is not upset if you're not scoring on those first couple drives because he's still learning things about the opposing defenses? Or do you look at the teams Penn State's played and said, kind of regardless of that, they probably should have scored more points than they have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be part of it. We've kind of seen the way that they adapt their game plan as the game goes, and they kind of figure out what's working and then kind of stick with that. And we've seen in a lot of these games, if you go back and kind of watch the highlights, you'll see a lot of their big plays, a lot of their touchdowns in these games are on very similar looking plays, depending on the opponent. And you can kind of see where they're able to identify weaknesses, within the coverage and things like that. But again, against, a team like Kent State, a team like Bowling Green, where Penn State came out a little bit flat at the very beginning, that's something where even if, you weren't expecting a specific defensive alignment or, they threw something unexpected at you or something happened offensively where you got set behind the chains, those are still things that you should be able to overcome against an opponent like that. So I feel like Penn State has made, good adjustments, especially at halftime. And I think the in-helmet communication has a lot to do with that. We've heard how that kind of helps them, and the offensive coordinator can kind of talk to the quarterbacks. And I think a lot of the times they'll be looking at the defense and kind of reading what's going on, and then telling the quarterback, maybe, watch for this safety or watch for, this linebacker or whatever it may be, and giving them advice and things like that. And I think they've done a good job with those adjustments, but I just worry that they've been taking almost too long to kind of find that rhythm, and we haven't really seen them do it from the jump.
Yeah, I think it's a concern because I think in some of these ways you should have been outskilling some of these teams. But I also, look back to 2016, and I think a hallmark. I make a lot of comparisons to the 2016 team on this podcast because I think it's a similar situation where you're bringing in an innovative offensive coordinator. It's not always looking seamless early on. I think they've done a better job this year than they did obviously in 2016 when they lost at Pitt and then lost badly at Michigan. But I also look at the connective tissue of, that team was known. It was kind of a meme at the time, right? Second half team. They were losing against Minnesota, Ohio State, in the Big Ten title game against Wisconsin. They trailed in the Rose Bowl against this very USC team before they scored 7 touchdowns in a row. Again, it was a fairly sluggish start, but that was probably the greatest sequence of offensive football Penn State's ever played in that Rose Bowl. Granted, they ended up giving up 52 points and losing the game, but the offense really did all it could do to win that game. And so is that coincidental, or do you think this team can and will be a second half team like that one as we get into the second half of the schedule?
If I had to guess, I would think they probably figure it out, just because I think some of the struggles have to do with all the moving pieces they've had. Whether it's new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator, all the transfers coming in, all the guys who left for the draft. I think there were just so many moving pieces that it's kind of taken a bit for Penn State to figure out. And I almost feel like they're trying out different things throughout the first few games, because we saw it was Harrison Wallace, week 1 against West Virginia went over 100 yards. And then a couple games later, Omari Evans does it. Next game, Tyler Warren does it. Next game, Liam Clifford goes over 100 yards. And I almost feel like they're kind of trying out different weapons in different games and kind of figuring out, what are these receiver skill sets? What are they good at? How reliable are they? And I think they're kind of giving them a chance to kind of prove themselves and kind of figure out really the personnel that they have, because again, a lot of these guys are really unproven. Penn State lost its 2 leading receivers from last year's team, at least in terms of yardage. You could argue who the leading receivers were behind KLS, but Dante Cephas finished second in yardage. He's at Kansas State now. And so you kind of had some unproven commodities heading into the season. I think it's taken a little while for Penn State to kind of figure out who they can rely on. Obviously Tyler Warren's been a big one, but they already knew that going in, and they've kind of used him as that security blanket. But I think now they have some more trust in some of the other guys. Omari Evans specifically on those deep balls, and then Liam Clifford had some explosive plays, 3 big plays last Saturday. So I think those guys have kind of stepped up and proven themselves. And now that Penn State has a bit of a better understanding of what it really has, and Kotelnicki kind of knows, what kind of weapons he has, I think they'll do a better job of coming out faster. And it's also something Franklin has now mentioned for 2 or 3 straight weeks where he says they want to get out to a faster start. So it's certainly been an emphasis of the team. And I do think they will, figure out a way to get better at that.
You set up my next question well, Joel, about the receivers. James Franklin said, he thinks that they've been successful so far, that they've had those different guys step up, like you mentioned. No one's really, dominating the stat sheet. This is not a KJ Hamler, Pat Freiermuth passing game where it was those two and practically nobody else. What grade do you give that group so far for their production and how they've come from being a real liability last season to, I don't think you can say that this season. Are they a strength per se? Are you winning games with your receivers? I don't know. I don't know if they're at that level yet. I think that's why I'd probably give them a B, but I think they've made a lot of progress compared to last year where it just felt like they were out of the game completely at times.
Yeah, I mean, I think I lean toward the B, maybe B- range, which I don't know, might feel a little bit harsh to some people, but again, they've done what they've needed to do to win games, and they've made some plays at times. But I still feel like we've seen some issues. Again, whether it's the slow starts or whether it's a couple drops here and there or things like that, where the offense has just kind of stalled out at times. And I think, there's just more to be done. And again, they've flashed. It's kind of been different guys flashing at different times. I don't think I've seen a game where, we've had multiple receivers really pop. And I think that's what they would need to get to that next level. But a B- performance, if you can get, an A in the run game and an A from your tight ends and, an A from the defense should be enough to win probably 11 out of 12, maybe 12 out of 12 games this season. So again, they haven't been, great. By no means have they been, the best unit on the team, but I think they've been serviceable and they've done enough. And I think the biggest impact of, the improvement from the wide receivers is that they're kind of freeing stuff up for the running game. Defenses have been, they haven't been able to load the box as much, a lot of too high safety looks, which is something Drew Aller talked about. And we've seen that reflected in the stats with Nick Singleton, especially. I mean, I think Kaytron statistically is pretty similar to what he did last year, but Singleton is, almost doubling his yards per carry from like 4 to 7 this year compared to last year. And his longest run, last season was only 20 yards. Now it's up to 41 already. And I if I had to guess, I would say he'll probably break that at some point down the stretch. But I think it's really not only the wide receivers, taking that little step forward. I think it's enough to help the whole offense. You're giving Drew more confidence as well, giving him kind of more targets that he feels comfortable throwing to, and then you're just opening things up for some of the other groups on the team, running backs, things like that. I mean, football obviously is the ultimate team sport where everyone kind of needs to be working together in order to succeed. And even with, the wide receivers improvement, it kind of, helps balance out the offense, and having a more functional offense that's not just, one-sided running, having that more balanced offense can extend drives. And then now you're giving the defense more rest and you're limiting possessions for the opponent. So it's even things like that, are just helping the entire team kind of take that next step that they were kind of missing last year.
Are Penn State's corners ready for USC, Joel? We talked about them as the liability they appeared to be in the Peach Bowl after some of those departing seniors left. You come back, you add some transfers, Jalen Kimber, A.J. Harris, who've done some good things early on. But I mean, I don't know that they faced a test like this with the playmakers USC has and Zachariah Branch, Jakobi Lane. Do you know what to expect from this group, or do you still have a lot of question marks heading into this game on how they're going to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point we've got a pretty good idea of who USC is, and we know they're going to be a heavy passing team. I think Miller Moss is throwing like 40 attempts per game, something like that. So obviously they're going to air it out. That'll probably be their strategy again this year against Penn State. And I really feel like I think they have 3 receivers over 200 yards right now. So they've definitely got some threats, some playmakers, and that's kind of what USC has been known for. Penn State brands itself as LBU. I think USC kind of throws itself in the wide receiver U conversation. And they've definitely got some playmakers in that room, and it should be a lot more than anything Penn State has seen so far this season. So it really will be a big test for that secondary. But I mean, they sound confident, and why wouldn't they be after this start that they've had, 5-0, and a pretty solid, overall performance from the defense. Obviously, you could nitpick some things, but I would say, overall the defense has played really well to start the season, and I think their confidence is at an all-time high. We got to talk to Zachy Wheatley earlier, who's been playing pretty well and earning some recognition for his play so far, and he was asked about playing USC's air raid offense and kind of how the secondary felt and how they were preparing for that challenge, and he said, more throws, more passes, that's just more opportunities for us to get interceptions. So they seem pretty confident in their ability to handle that. I think they know that they're going to have to step up in this matchup, but again, it's kind of some new pieces, and with Jalen Kimber, A.J. Harris transferring in, obviously they've played SEC ball before, so they know what it's like to go up against some big time wide receivers. I think that experience is going to be huge for them. But again, we've never seen those two playing together with the rest of the Penn State secondary. We've never seen them all kind of together in a big game like this. We know what they did against the previous teams, but yeah, I don't think Penn State has played an offense quite like this. So I'm expecting there to be, a little bit of a shock initially against really a trio of great wide receivers.
Yeah, but you make an important point. We've seen Miller Moss make mistakes. I think he's a pretty good quarterback, but I don't think he's like Matt Barkley in his prime or anything quite yet. So it'll be interesting to see if Penn State can force him into mistakes with the athletes that they have. Joel, what's the importance of getting Nick Singleton back this week? I know James Franklin was asked about him in the weekly news conference, said he thought that Nick Singleton was ready to go last week. He was obviously in uniform on the sideline, but then we don't see him play. Is it important for Penn State to have him as a weapon in this game? Because I'll tell you, I thought Kaytron Allen looked like he got a little bit worn down and taking, I think he had 21 carries last week against UCLA, finishes with 3.7 yards per carry. Not bad, but not, I think, what Penn State had been getting accustomed to in terms of the push they were getting and things like that. So is it important to have Nick Singleton in this backfield for a game of this magnitude?
Yeah, I think it's huge for a few reasons. First of all, I mean, I think it's funny just the way that James has kind of handled this situation with last week. We didn't see him at practice last week, and he was asked about it. He said he didn't want to comment at the time, and then we saw him go out for warmups. Before last week's game against UCLA, he looked fine. He was fielding kicks and running through drills with the running backs, and then eventually doesn't play. He was listed as questionable on the availability report, so we got really no insight there. It really came down to the game time decision, and then right before the game, on the big scoreboard, they do all the starters, and they had both Singleton and Allen named as starters for the game. So, we thought he was good to go. And then, Kaytron Allen comes out for the first drive. And even talking to Drew Aller this week, he said, when Kaytron went out for the first drive, it was a little bit surprising because he was expecting to see Singleton. And even when Kaytron came out for the first drive, he still thought, okay, well, we'll get Singleton for the second drive, I guess. So even Aller didn't know. And Franklin said it was truly a game time decision where the head trainer and the running backs coach, Jay Sider, came up to him, literally minutes before kickoff and said that, Singleton couldn't go. So we still have really no insight into the situation. We don't know what necessarily it was that Singleton was dealing with. But we do know they thought he would be back last weekend, should definitely be back this weekend. Barring any type of setback, they're expecting to have him back. And I think that could make the difference in the game. I mean, if Singleton doesn't play, I think it could be really bad news for Penn State, because I think the strategy, if you're the Nittany Lions, is to kind of follow what Minnesota was able to do last Saturday against USC, which was, just running the ball over and over, kind of wearing them down. I think USC has done a pretty good job the last couple of years, kind of bringing in guys on that defensive side of the ball, trying to kind of bulk up and bringing in D'Anton Lynn from UCLA, former Penn State cornerback, to coach their defense. I think they've done a better job kind of defensively, building up that size and getting ready for the Big Ten, but I don't know if they're necessarily there. I think if Penn State's going to win, I think, it should be able to win in the trenches. And, with the run game and things like that, kind of wearing down that USC defense. But like you mentioned, Kaytron Allen last week without Singleton was only 3.7 yards per carry. And if you're relying on Kaytron again and he's picking up, 2-3 yards here and there, and the drives are stalling out and you're going 3 and out, that strategy doesn't really work. You need to be able to kind of have these long sustained drives. So I think it's really important to have Singleton back, and especially just to relieve Kaytron, because, if Kaytron starts to get tired and the yards per carry start to dip down, all of a sudden you're giving USC the ball back really quickly. So I think just having that stable run game, and obviously, there's been some argument about who's the better running back between Kaytron and Allen. And, we know Singleton was better 2 years ago, and then Allen statistically was better last year. And then this year looks like it's back to Singleton being better. They're kind of doing this weird, flip-flop situation. But, Singleton clearly this year to me has been the better running back. And I think, Penn State's going to need to rely on him heavily this week against USC.
Well, and I think they work in tandem, right? Ideally, Joel, is I think Kaytron's the guy you want to slam into the opposing line of scrimmage and kind of beat them into submission. And you want to open up some holes where Singleton may be a little bit faster, a little quicker. I think Kaytron Allen sets things up for Nick Singleton. That's why I think they're a nice tandem. And when you only have one, and defenses don't have to worry about Kaytron Allen necessarily taking a ball 75 yards because he doesn't quite have that top end speed that Nick Singleton has. It makes life more difficult for him because now he's having to, absorb those hits in greater volume and maybe wearing down a little bit. So, I don't know. It's a good point. Who's better? I just think they're both different styles. And when you don't have Singletons to a lightning and thunder type thing, not to say that Kaytron Allen is like Jerome Bettis or anything, just that, that I think their games complement each other well. And I think when you take one out of the equation, it makes life more difficult for the other. I think we would have seen it if it was Kaytron hurt last week for Nick Singleton. I'm sure that would have hurt his YPC a little bit, just because I don't think he's the guy that's going to beat a team into submission. So definitely important for Penn State to get him back. I also wanted to ask you about this. James Franklin was asked about leaving earlier in the week. I think they're leaving on Thursday, because they have to fly out of Harrisburg. So they got to, schlep over there, maybe an hour, hour and a half, whatever that drive is, then get on the planes in Harrisburg to fly to LA. And James Franklin said, he kind of views it as a problem in this expanded Big Ten. He said State College needs to consider lengthening the runway. And that's not true. I think just for sports, he brought up, is the community, the flights that you can and can't get in there with a shorter runway. I mean, I remember when, I think Obama visited Penn State in like 2008, and they had to bring the smaller Air Force One because the real Air Force One couldn't land there. So it's not like it's a new problem, but logistically it is going to be more difficult making these West Coast trips for Penn State. Do you think we maybe overlooked some of these little finer points when talking about, Big Ten expansion and the impact it would have here, and not yet necessarily just for those teams in the West Coast that are going to have to travel east a lot more?
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's a bigger hater of the Big Ten out there than James Franklin. A lot of people like to say the rivalries between the Big Ten and the SEC. I think it might be between the Big Ten and James Franklin, whether it's complaining about, starting the season on the road, playing these Big Ten openers on the road, or whatever it may be. Now it's, the runway at the State College Airport isn't big enough. I feel like there's always something to complain about. I don't know how much of an impact it really makes on Penn State to have, an hour and a half drive to Harrisburg before the flight, as opposed to leaving direct. Like, obviously, that's an extra, 90 minutes of travel or whatever. But, I really don't know how much of an impact that actually has on the game. I think he's just kind of finding things to complain about. I mean, you listen to his point, he does have somewhat of a point when you look at kind of some of the other East Coast schools. Rutgers and Maryland both have nearby, large airports that they can use if they're traveling to the West Coast. And Penn State obviously is one of the farthest east schools in the Big Ten. So for them, travel to the West Coast is a little bit harder than, maybe in Iowa or in Ohio State or whoever. But, at the end of the day, it's, I don't know, to me, it's, you're traveling on Thursday. So you still have, all of Friday to kind of relax and rest up because of the additional travel. And, at the end of the day, guys are probably just going to be, relaxing on the car ride over, the bus ride over. They're maybe taking a nap. Like, I don't think it's something that's really draining them. I don't think it's something that's going to cause them to come out sluggish or anything like that. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I would feel differently if I was the one who had to make the trip, but to me, it just seems like kind of a nothing burger. I don't think it really is that big of an issue. I mean, I will say there is an interesting stat I saw that where I was looking into it, and Big Ten teams that are traveling either to the West Coast or from the West Coast, or 1-8 on the road. So that is an interesting stat. And there are some pretty kind of surprising results in there. You look at Michigan losing to Washington is kind of one of them that stands out to me. A few of those games, but even still, I mean, I think I don't think it's really anything that's going to make a big impact on this game. I think, just the travel in general, maybe the time zone change and things like that will have an impact, but an extra, 90-minute drive to Harrisburg on Thursday, I don't think that really impacts, a Saturday game, but that's just me.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just the Big Ten. I remember when Penn State went to Ireland in 2014, I covered that game. It was James Franklin's first game, and he was asked a lot of questions about, would you do this again? Because it was a great game. Penn State won on a last-second field goal. People were feeling good about it, but James Franklin was still in the post-game, press conference talking about, well, you gotta get every roll of tape documented for customs. It was just such a hassle, and you could tell he really didn't want to be in Ireland for that game. But I think as a community, Joel, that I think it would help Penn State to have a bigger airport, or at least the ability to bring some of those bigger planes in. Yes, it would help for sports, but I think it would help students. It would help bring in corporate interests and things of that nature to kind of build the base a little bit more. So I do think there's some merit to his conversation on the university-wide level, but I think you're right in terms of sports. It should not be that big of a deal for its impact on Penn State. I also wanted to ask about this. Do you think the 3:30 kickoff kind of helps Penn State? Because it's going to be kind of, I think, a similar routine to playing a noon game at Beaver Stadium. That's something they've obviously done several times, not just at Beaver Stadium, but I believe the West Virginia game was a noon kickoff as well. I think at least in terms of the time change, things are working out fairly well for them, where their bodies really shouldn't feel too different. If it had been, an earlier start, obviously it'd be 9 a.m. on the West Coast. I know they've talked about that sometimes. But I would think that would be a bigger disadvantage for USC even in that case. But I think 3:30 Eastern is kind of the perfect window for Penn State's in terms of the body.
Yeah. I mean, I think if it was maybe a noon Eastern time, that probably hurts USC more than anything, just because everything gets pushed back and it's 9 a.m. kick over there, and then by the time you obviously want a few hours in advance to get to the stadium and things like that. So I think that would hurt, maybe USC if it had been an earlier kick, but I think 3:30 is pretty fair for both teams, I would say. For Penn State, you don't really have to worry too much about it being too early or too late compared to kind of what you're used to. Again, on their body, it'll I guess feel like a noon kick, I feel like
12:30 Pacific.
Right. So yeah. So for them, it'll feel like 3:30. And that's fine. I feel like once you've been there for a couple of days, again, they're leaving on Thursday, so they should have a couple of days to adjust with the sleep and things like that. But even if they didn't, and even if they were flying out there on a Friday night, you still should be able to, get your body up and running by the time it's 3:30 Eastern time, regardless. So I don't think it plays too much of an impact. I think maybe if it had been, a noon Eastern kick, that's a little bit of a different situation for both teams. But yeah, I think the conference kind of knew that when they were scheduling this game and trying to get that figured out. I think a night game would have been pretty cool, but obviously there's a lot of things that go into that with contracts and things like that. So I think 3:30 is probably a pretty good scenario for both teams. I think, neither of them really have too much to complain about there.
I wanted to ask you about this, Joel. How much does USC's loss to Minnesota potentially damage this game as either a win or a loss for Penn State? Because I think if you win, now USC is a 3-loss team with some difficult games to go. They still got Rutgers, Washington, Nebraska, Notre Dame. They're probably trending toward 4 or 5 losses at the end of the season instead of what this game was a week ago, which was, they were 11th in the country. They had 1 loss. And then if you lose this game, or even if you win this game, I don't think you're getting the credit that you were hoping to resume-wise out of it, because it would have been a ranked-on-ranked game if they don't lose to Minnesota. But now I believe USC is unranked. So I think this is probably one of the bigger impacts I can remember in recent Penn State history of a team that I think you were counting on for resume purposes, dropping a game kind of at the worst possible time for, establishing your own.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think it's horrible for Penn State. First of all, I don't know how USC can drop from 11 to unranked after a one-score loss to a Big Ten opponent. I don't know how that made that big of a difference in the voters' minds to drop them entirely out of the rankings after being on the borderline of the top 10. Because if USC wins that game, let's say the roles were reversed a little bit and USC maybe wins by one score, a couple points, whatever it is, they're probably in the top 10 this week. And, all of a sudden, just because a few plays went differently and they lose by one score, they're now unranked. They do sit atop that, others receiving votes category at number 26 unofficially. But, and I know, like I referenced last week, the did we really get beat that bad ranking, which is, kind of the net success rate between the two teams. I saw that USC had a higher success rate than Minnesota. And so kind of that post-game win expectancy, statistically, USC probably should have won that game, had a little bit of trouble with turnovers and things like that. And I got to catch most of that game, and I felt like USC was probably, the better, more talented team, just had a few things go against them, and couldn't get a stop late. But I still think USC is the same team, that I thought they were before that Minnesota game. I still think they're a very dangerous team with a good offense. They've got a few playmakers on defense. That's, obviously the weaker side of the ball for them if you had to pick one. But it's a very talented team that always recruits well. And again, they were just number 11 last week. And if they had found a way to squeak out the win against Minnesota, I mean, they beat them statistically. They just weren't able to beat them on the scoreboard. But if they had, you're looking at a top 10 matchup with a whole lot more national recognition. So I think if you're Penn State, you still have to treat this as if, it's kind of one of those big marquee ranked matchups. And obviously the spread is pretty small. I think it went up by a couple points. I think it opened, Penn State was 2.5 point favorites. Now it's like 4.5, something like that.
I think I saw 5 this morning, Joel.
5. So yeah, it seems like it's growing a little bit. I'm not exactly sure why, because again, after kind of seeing that,
there's a ton of money coming in on Penn State, because I actually did our Post-Gazette sports betting guide. I think it's like 90% of the bets and the money is on Penn State at this point. So that would explain why the books are kind of moving the money.
Okay. Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, if everyone's hopping on Penn State, I mean, if you're just looking at this game in a vacuum and saying it's the number 4 team in the country playing an unranked team, you expect them to win by, at least a touchdown probably. So I can kind of understand the logic there. But again, this is a team that was, could have been in the top 10 had they managed to squeak out the win last Saturday, and all of a sudden it's unranked. But I do think, kind of going back to your original question, it sucks for Penn State, because even if you beat them, it's like, okay, they weren't a ranked team. You don't even get a ranked win out of it. And it's a team that, talent-wise is probably top 10, top 15 in the country. And if you lose, obviously it looks terrible, because, you just lost to an unranked team. And for all the struggles Franklin has had against ranked opponents and top 10 opponents, and, all the statistics that you want to pull out there, he's been pretty good against unranked teams. So now to lose to an unranked team would be, at least in terms of narrative, it would be bad for Penn State. In terms of actual strength, like even if Penn State loses to USC this week, right? Which, I mean, I don't think they will, but I do expect it to be close. And even if Penn State loses, the narrative will be like really bad for Penn State. Like the narrative will be that, they came out flat, they didn't perform well, that they were fraudulent, that, they don't have, those quality wins, things like that, the narrative is going to be really bad. And I think even if Penn State loses this game, as long as they, win the rest of their games outside of Ohio State, they can still finish 10-2 and make the playoffs. So I just kind of want to, throw that out there as a reminder that, even a loss here, I don't think is the end of the world. For
no, but like we talked about last week, Joel, I think it is damaging in the sense of, I think Penn State's upside at 10-2 is maybe one of the last 2 or 3 seeds in. You're going on the road at that point, as opposed to, they're in a good position at this point to host a home game. I think even if you lose to Ohio State, you lose a home game, you lose this game, and this is going to set up my next question for you. Well, it really damages you in this Big Ten race, because I think if you win this game, if you can go 11-1. You're going to have some chances here. Let me get into this question, because I think it dovetails pretty well. Who are you rooting for in this Oregon-Ohio State game on Saturday? If you're a Penn State fan, do you want Oregon to win so that, if you're Penn State, maybe you can deal a knockout blow to, you definitely probably could not deal a knockout blow to Ohio State in terms of the Big Ten title game, not have to play them at a neutral site, play in Oregon, or play, maybe, I don't know, Michigan slides in there or something, even though they have a couple of losses at this point. Maybe you draw a different team than Ohio State, who I think you're not going to want to match up on a neutral field. Or do you want Ohio State to win, give Oregon a loss so that even if you lose that game to Ohio State, you have a chance in some tiebreaker scenarios to set up a rematch in Indianapolis? How are you looking at that game in the context of, this Big Ten race and the importance of winning the conference to avoid the first round entirely?
Yeah. There are so many possible, combinations of outcomes. And as you were going through the question, I was kind of running through them frantically in my head to kind of like run the numbers of what are the odds with, this team winning, this team winning. I think if you're Penn State, you're hoping that Ohio State wins. I think just because then you could potentially have both Penn State and Ohio State as undefeated teams when they match up, and Ohio State could maybe be the number one team you could have, if Texas loses, because Texas plays Georgia, I think in 2 weeks. And if Texas loses to Georgia, which is very possible, and then Ohio State beats Oregon, Penn State has a chance to jump, Oregon and Texas, and Ohio State would probably be number one. So you're looking at a potential number one versus number two matchup when Penn State hosts Ohio State. If those things kind of fall that way, which, obviously that's kind of, a hypothetical, and that's a little bit ahead of ourselves. But I think, if you're Penn State, you want Ohio State to be ranked as highly as they can be before they come to Happy Valley. And you would rather, if you're Penn State, you're operating under, the assumption that you want to beat Ohio State, obviously, and you're hoping that you can do that. And if you're going to beat Ohio State, you want them to be number one instead of, number 5 with a loss to Oregon, because then it gets kind of tricky. But I think, and even if you lose to Ohio State, but you play them close, I would have to look more into kind of the tiebreaker scenarios for the Big Ten. But, if Penn State and Oregon both lose to Ohio State, finish 11-1, there's, it would be some kind of tiebreaker between the two of them. But I think Penn State, still with a loss to Ohio State would have a chance to get in. Whereas if Oregon beats Ohio State and then Ohio State beats Penn State, I don't think Penn State gets in over either of those two teams based on tiebreakers. So I think if you're Penn State, you want Ohio State to win this one.
Yeah, I still just, if you're Penn State, I kind of think you want the team that you have a chance to beat to lose, because that's there's a potential that you could go 11-1 and get left out of this Big Ten title game. And I just think that's going to be frustrating to a lot of people, that you're not even going to get a chance to play to stay out of that first round, that you're basically being relegated to having to host a first round game against, it's going to be a tough team that you're going to now have to beat just to get to where you would have been if you could have gotten into the Big Ten title game. So I think it's a close call for me too, Joel, but I think I'm leaning toward Oregon just because you don't get a chance to beat them and you do get a chance to beat Ohio State. And listen, if you lose to Ohio State on your home field, probably not the Big Ten champion anyway. If we're being, charitable here. That's how I'm looking at it. I would just hate for Penn State to end up in a situation where, it's not decided on the field whether they get to go to Indy or not. I think you'd rather kind of have your chance against Ohio State, but I can certainly see the opposite perspective. Joel, any final thoughts on the week before we sign off?
No, I would just say, I think this game, this is what we've been waiting for, right? This is one of the 2 games that you circled on your calendar as kind of a game that's going to tell you what Penn State really is. And I think we're going to be able to learn a lot. So we should have, kind of a lot of new information to go off of based on the result and how Penn State performs in this game. So I'm excited to see it.
I'm excited as well. Going to be a fun game to attend. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. I think I'm going to try to do a post-game video, somewhere around the Coliseum if possible, kind of analyze the game that happened. So subscribe to the channel for that. Joel will be back next week. I'll be hanging out in LA. I'll be doing a little bit of vacationing, maybe some Disneyland, maybe a Vanderpump Rules bar tour, something like that. So make sure you subscribe. Joel will be back with a guest. And then obviously we've got lots of Steelers content on the page. We're going to have the Steelers versus Vegas on Sunday, the North Shore Drive with Christopher Carter. We'll have the post-game live stream. I believe Christopher Carter will be doing that. So make sure you're subscribed, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.